I'm Amber Paddington, 36, a small-town kid who worked her way up to command a unit. For years, I sent money home and showed up for my mother without asking for anything back. But when she stood at her anniversary party and called me a failure only for her new son to stare at me and whisper, "Mom, she's my commander," I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been humiliated by someone you gave everything to? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there for months before the anniversary party, subtle at first, then increasingly bold. My mother had always been sharp-tongued, but her remarriage seemed to give her license to be crueler. She developed this habit of pausing mid-sentence when I entered a room, as if my presence interrupted something important. At family dinners, she'd introduce topics I couldn't contribute to: her new husband's golf games, his daughter's piano recitals, their shared memories from a life I wasn't part of. "Amber's been so busy with her little job," she'd say when neighbors asked about me, her emphasis on little, deliberate. My rank as captain meant nothing in her living room. 20 years of military service reduced to a hobby she tolerated. The rehearsals started 3 weeks before the party. I'd catch her practicing introductions in front of the bathroom mirror, gesturing to invisible guests. "This is my husband, Richard, and our son, Adam." Never my children or my family. Always our son, as if motherhood began with her second marriage. I told myself it was nerves. Anniversary parties make people anxious. She wanted everything perfect, and I'd learned long ago that perfect, in her world, didn't include me. But the rehearsals grew longer, more elaborate. She'd stand in the kitchen, wine glass in hand, voice carrying through the thin walls. Amber's had her struggles, of course. We all know about that situation. I never knew which situation she meant. My father leaving when I was 12? My decision to join the military instead of college? The deployments that kept me away during holidays? She had a catalog of my failures, real and imagined, and she rotated through them like prayer beads. Richard encouraged her. I'd see him nodding along, that satisfied smile men get when they think they're solving a problem by simply existing. His presence validated her narrative that I'd been the issue all along. With him, she was the perfect wife who'd overcome the burden of a difficult daughter. Adam was different. 19, fresh out of basic training, assigned to my base through what I assumed was coincidence. He'd been polite during our brief interactions, professional but distant. I didn't mention the family connection during duty hours. Military protocol demanded separation between personal and professional relationships, especially when ranks were involved. But I'd noticed him watching me during formation, something curious in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but awareness. Like he was solving a puzzle he hadn't known existed. The anniversary invitations were elegant, cream cardstock with gold lettering. "Richard and Margaret Paddington request your presence." No mention of family, no hint that this celebration would become my humiliation. Looking back, that should have been warning enough. She spent hours on the guest list, calling neighbors I'd grown up with, colleagues from her book club, friends from church. People who'd known me since childhood, who'd watched me graduate high school with honors, who'd attended my promotion ceremonies when she couldn't be bothered to travel. They'd see me reduced to a cautionary tale at her celebration. The house preparations took on military precision, which might have been funny if it weren't so pointed. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched in months, arranged flowers like centerpieces for state dinners, polished silver that had gathered dust since her first marriage. Everything had to reflect her new status as Richard's wife, mother to his successful son. I offered to help, of course. Old habits die hard, and despite everything, she was still my mother. But she waved me away with practiced dismissal. "You've done enough already, Amber." The words carried weight beyond simple rejection. They carried judgment. The night before the party, I found her in the kitchen, staring at a photo of Adam in his dress uniform. She'd already removed my military portraits from the mantel, replacing them with wedding pictures and Richard's golf trophies. But she held Adam's photo like it redeemed something in her past. "He's everything I hoped for in a child," she said without looking up. Respectful. Grateful. None of the complications. I wanted to ask what complications she meant, but I knew. I was the complication. The reminder of her first marriage, her younger self, her mistakes. Adam represented a clean slate, a chance to be the mother she'd convinced herself she'd always been. Standing in that kitchen, watching her cradle a photograph of a son who'd known her for less than a year while dismissing a daughter who'd spent 3 decades trying to earn her approval, I finally understood. This wasn't about the anniversary. This wasn't about Richard or Adam or even me. This was about rewriting history. She decided her story began with her second marriage, and everyone at that party would witness her declaration. They'd see her joy, her perfect family, her triumph over past difficulties. I'd be the difficult past, put in my place for everyone to see. I should have declined the invitation. Should have found an excuse, a deployment, an emergency that required my attention elsewhere. But something stubborn in me refused to give her that satisfaction. If she wanted to make me part of her performance, I'd be there. I'd watch her audience, see how they responded to her version of our family story. The morning of the party, she was already dressed by 8, adjusting her jewelry in front of the hallway mirror. Richard whistled his appreciation, and she glowed under his attention. This was her moment, her stage, her chance to cement the narrative she'd been crafting for months. Adam arrived in civilian clothes, flowers for his mother, handshake for Richard. He nodded at me politely, nothing more. Just another guest at his mother's celebration. I chose my outfit carefully. Not uniform, that would have been too obvious, too confrontational. But something that suggested competence, authority, success. If she wanted to introduce me as a failure, I'd make her work for it. The guests began arriving at 5. Neighbors, book club friends, church ladies, Richard's golf buddies. They filled the living room with polite conversation and genuine affection for my mother. She moved among them gracefully, accepting congratulations, sharing anecdotes about married life. For moments at a time, she almost seemed happy. But I caught her watching me, calculating. The evening script was already written. She just needed the right moment to deliver her lines. I'd long grown used to the subtle ways my mother set me apart, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. The laughter was too bright, the conversations too pointed. Everyone was playing their role in her anniversary production, and mine was about to begin. The anniversary party was supposed to celebrate 5 years of marriage between my mother and Richard. Instead, she turned it into theater, with me cast as the cautionary tale. The living room filled with familiar faces, neighbors who'd watched me grow up, colleagues from her book club who'd heard stories about my deployments, friends from church who'd prayed for my safe returns. They came expecting celebration and left with front-row seats to my humiliation. She waited until the crowd had gathered, until conversations had died down and attention focused naturally on the happy couple. Richard stood beside her, his arm around her waist, both of them glowing with satisfaction. Adam hung back near the kitchen, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but dutiful enough to stay close. "Thank you all for coming," my mother began, her voice carrying easily through the room. 5 years ago, Richard gave me something I thought I'd never have, a real family. She paused for the expected murmur of approval, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on me. Before Richard, I thought I knew what motherhood meant. But I was wrong. The room shifted slightly, sensing something beyond simple gratitude in her tone. I stood near the back, drink untouched in my hand, watching her perform. "I spent years trying to fix what couldn't be fixed," she continued, her voice gaining confidence. "Trying to make something worthwhile out of disappointment. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, some people are just determined to be failures." The murmur died completely. Guests glanced around, uncomfortable with the sudden shift in mood. This wasn't anniversary joy anymore. This was something else entirely. "Amber," she said, gesturing toward me with her wine glass, "is my daughter from my first marriage. A bastard child, really, since her father left before she could amount to anything. I did my best with limited material, but you can't build character where none exists." The silence was deafening. Faces turned toward me, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and morbid curiosity. Some had known me since childhood, had watched me excel in school, had celebrated my military achievements. Others knew only my mother's version of events, the difficult daughter who'd caused so much trouble. I'm sure some of you remember Amber's struggles, she continued, warming to her theme. The anger issues, the rebellion, the way she ran off to play soldier rather than face her responsibilities at home. But thankfully, Richard brought me a real child to raise properly. She turned toward Adam with genuine affection, her voice softening. Adam has been everything a mother could want in a son. Respectful, grateful, successful. He's shown me what real family feels like. Adam stepped forward reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight, but trapped by social expectation. My mother beamed at him, this perfect son who validated her narrative about good parenting and family values. Adam is following in the finest military tradition, she announced. Serving his country with honor, making his family proud. Everything I tried to teach Amber but couldn't, because you can't give someone integrity if they don't want it. The applause was scattered, uncertain. People clapped because the moment seemed to call for it, but their faces showed confusion. This wasn't celebration anymore. This was performance, and they weren't sure of their role. That's when Adam looked at me directly for the first time all evening. I saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His face went pale, his carefully maintained composure cracking. The wine glass in his hand trembled slightly as understanding dawned. "Mom," he said, his voice cutting through the room's tension. "She's my commander." The words dropped like stones into still water. My mother's triumphant smile faltered, confusion replacing confidence. "What do you mean, honey?" "Captain Paddington," Adam said, his voice stronger now, military training overriding social awkwardness. "She's my commanding officer at the base. I report to her every day." The room erupted in nervous laughter, the kind that accompanies dramatic irony in amateur theater. Guests looked back and forth between my mother and me, pieces clicking into place. The failure she'd just finished mocking outranked the perfect son she'd been praising. My mother's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to embarrassment, and finally to something approaching panic. Her carefully constructed narrative had just collapsed in front of everyone who mattered to her social standing. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Amber's just..." "Captain Paddington has been my CO for 6 months, Adam interrupted, his military bearing asserting itself despite the family drama. "She's responsible for training and evaluating junior officers in my unit. She's actually really respected on base." The silence that followed was different from before. Instead of uncomfortable anticipation, it carried the weight of revelation. These people had just watched my mother publicly humiliate someone who apparently commanded respect in professional settings. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible. Richard's arm dropped from my mother's waist. His smug satisfaction had evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that his wife had just committed social suicide in their living room. His golf buddies were staring at him with expressions ranging from pity to secondhand embarrassment. I stood perfectly still, letting the moment unfold without interference. This wasn't my drama anymore. This was my mother discovering that reality doesn't bend to wishful thinking. Her perfect narrative about family and success had just shattered against facts she'd chosen to ignore. The laughter died away, leaving only the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Guests began checking their phones, gathering purses, making subtle moves toward the door. The party was effectively over, killed by truth delivered in Adam's shocked whisper. My mother looked at me across the room, her face a mixture of accusation and desperate confusion. As if this were somehow my fault, as if I'd orchestrated this revelation to spite her. But I'd done nothing except exist in the same space where she decided to perform her cruelty. "I think I should go," I said quietly, setting my untouched drink on the nearest table. Not because I was ashamed, but because the evening had served its purpose. Everyone in that room now understood exactly who my mother was and what I'd endured. No explanation was necessary. She'd wanted to erase me from her family story. Instead, She'd revealed the truth about herself to everyone who mattered in her social world. The justice was perfect and entirely of her own making. My mother was never gentle, even when I was small enough to need gentleness. I have clear memories of reaching for her approval and finding only sharp edges, criticism disguised as concern, love that came with conditions I could never quite meet. By the time I was old enough to understand that other children had different relationships with their mothers, the pattern was already set. I would achieve, and she would find fault. I would excel, and she would minimize the accomplishment. School came naturally to me, which should have been a source of pride for any parent. Honor roll, advanced classes, teacher recommendations. I collected accolades like other children collected toys. But each achievement was met with qualified response. Good grades don't guarantee success, Amber. Being smart doesn't make you wise. Achievement without humility is just arrogance. I learned early that success with her meant being successful quietly, without drawing attention to myself or, by extension, to her. Athletics offered another avenue for approval. I threw myself into track and field, then swimming, then volleyball. My body became a machine for generating accomplishments she might finally notice and celebrate. Trophies lined my bedroom shelves, ribbons hung from my mirror, newspaper clippings accumulated in a scrapbook she never looked at. Sports are fine for building character, she'd say, but they won't pay bills or find you a husband. The husband comment was particularly cutting because even as a teenager, I understood she'd married my father for the wrong reasons and paid the price when he left. Her bitterness about men had infected her advice to me about everything from career choices to social relationships. According to her worldview, women who focused on achievement were setting themselves up for disappointment and loneliness. When I announced my intention to join the military after high school graduation, she reacted as if I'd declared war on her personally. Running away won't solve your problems, Amber. The military is no place for women who want real lives. You're throwing away opportunities because you're too proud to admit you need help. The conversation lasted 3 hours and ended with her refusing to speak to me for 2 weeks. But I enlisted anyway, driven by something she'd never understand, the need to prove myself in an environment where achievement mattered more than family history. Basic training was brutal, but it was fair brutal. Everyone suffered equally, everyone earned respect through performance, everyone was judged by the same standards. For the first time in my life, I wasn't competing against her expectations. The military gave me structure, purpose, and eventually rank. Each promotion came with increased responsibility and clearer evidence of my competence. I led training exercises, managed personnel, made decisions that affected lives and missions. My superiors trusted me with increasingly complex assignments, and my subordinates respected my leadership. The confidence I'd never felt at home became natural in uniform. During my deployments, I sent money home regularly. Not because she asked, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. She was my mother, whatever our complicated history, and I was earning more than I could spend overseas. The checks went toward her mortgage, her car payments, her small luxuries. I wanted her to be comfortable, wanted her to see that my military career was providing stability and purpose. She never acknowledged the financial support directly, but I'd hear about it secondhand. Neighbors mentioned that she'd paid off her car early, that she'd renovated the kitchen, that she was taking classes at the community college. My deployments funded her small improvements and freedoms, but somehow that never translated to pride in my service. The calls home were exercises in careful navigation. She'd ask about my health, my safety, my plans for returning to civilian life. Always civilian life, as if my military career was temporary madness I'd eventually outgrow. She'd share news about neighbors, her book club activities, her dating life after my father's departure. But never questions about my work, my responsibilities, my achievements in an arena she'd never understood or approved of. When I made captain, I called to share the news. The promotion represented years of hard work, demonstrated leadership, and peer recognition. It was objective validation of my competence and potential. Her response was, "That's nice, dear. I hope it doesn't go to your head." No congratulations, no questions about what the rank meant, No acknowledgement that her daughter had earned something worth celebrating. That conversation should have been my wake-up call. Should have shown me clearly that no achievement would ever be enough, no success would ever change her fundamental assessment of my worth. But loyalty is a hard habit to break, especially when it's been cultivated through childhood disappointment and reinforced by military values. So I continued sending money, continued calling, continued hoping that somehow, someday, she'd see me clearly. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd learned to command respect from strangers while still begging for approval from the one person who'd known me longest and understood me least. When she remarried, I thought things might change. Richard seemed decent enough, stable, financially secure. Maybe with her own needs met, she'd have space to appreciate what I'd accomplished. Maybe a successful second marriage would soften her judgment of my choices. Instead, her remarriage seemed to validate her belief that I'd been the problem all along. With Richard, she was the perfect partner, supportive, gracious, socially appropriate. With his son Adam, she was the ideal mother, nurturing, proud, encouraging. They became proof that she'd always had the capacity for warmth and approval. I'd simply never deserved them. The contrast was deliberate and pointed. Adam's basic training was brave service to his country. My 20-year career was playing soldier. His respectful behavior toward his new stepmother was evidence of good upbringing. My financial support was never mentioned at all. She'd found her do-over family, and I was the rough draft she wanted to forget. That anniversary party wasn't really about celebrating 5 years of marriage. It was about publicly declaring that her story began with Richard, that her successful parenting started with Adam, that everything before them was prologue to her real life. She needed an audience to witness her transformation from struggling single mother to fulfilled wife and proud parent. I should have seen it coming, but loyalty makes you blind to cruelty until it's too late to protect yourself. After the party, word traveled fast through the networks that matter in small communities. Military bases are particularly efficient at spreading news, especially when it involves commanding officers and family drama. By Monday morning, I could sense the shift in how people looked at me, not with pity, but with a kind of respectful curiosity about how I'd maintained my composure. Adam appeared at my office door that first morning, standing at attention until I acknowledged him. Protocol demanded he request permission to speak freely about personal matters during duty hours. I granted it, curious about what he'd say after witnessing his mother's performance. "Ma'am, I need to apologize for what happened at the anniversary party," he began, his voice careful and formal. "I had no idea about your relationship to my stepmother or about her attitude toward your service." I studied his face, looking for deception or manipulation. But Adam was 19, fresh from basic training, still learning to navigate adult relationships and military hierarchy simultaneously. His distress seemed genuine. "You're not responsible for your mother's choices, specialist," I replied. "Your behavior has been appropriate and professional since you arrived at this base. That's what matters here." But he persisted, clearly troubled by the situation. "She never mentioned you were military, ma'am. She talked about her difficult daughter, who'd never amounted to anything, but she never said. I mean, when I saw your name on the duty roster, I never connected." The conversation revealed something important about my mother's selective storytelling. She'd shared enough details to establish her victim narrative without mentioning specifics that might complicate the story. Adam knew about the difficult daughter, but not about my rank, my responsibilities, or my financial support. The picture she'd painted was carefully edited to support her preferred version of events. My subordinates were more direct about their reactions. During a routine briefing, Staff Sergeant Reynolds made a comment about civilians who don't understand military service, and several heads nodded meaningfully. They weren't gossiping exactly, but they were processing what they'd learned about their commanding officer's family situation. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd been at the base for 3 years, approached me after the briefing. "Captain, if you don't mind me saying, some of us have dealt with similar family situations. If you ever need to talk to someone who understands, we're here." The offer was respectful, professional, and touched something in me that I hadn't realized was tender. The irony was sharp and satisfying. Here were people who'd known me for months or years, who'd worked under my command, who understood my competence and leadership through direct experience. Their respect was earned through daily interactions, not requested through blood relationships. They saw clearly what my mother had spent decades refusing to acknowledge. But the aftermath wasn't entirely positive. I found myself replaying that evening obsessively, analyzing every word, every expression, every moment of silence. The humiliation wasn't the worst part. Public embarrassment fades, and most people had recognized her behavior as inappropriate. What lingered was the finality of it, the realization that she'd chosen to burn our relationship publicly rather than acknowledge my worth privately. Sleep became difficult. I'd lie awake at night remembering her voice as she called me a failure, a bastard child, in front of people who'd known me since childhood. The words weren't true, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of similar judgments delivered more quietly. She'd simply said out loud what I'd suspected she'd always thought. My performance at work remained solid. Military training teaches you to compartmentalize personal issues during duty hours. But I caught myself being shorter with subordinates, less patient with administrative details, more focused on immediate tasks than long-term planning. The emotional energy I'd normally invest in leadership was being consumed by processing my mother's betrayal. 3 weeks after the party, she called. Not to apologize, but to explain. Her voice carried the same tone she'd used when I was a child and had misunderstood her intentions. Patient, slightly condescending, as if my hurt feelings were evidence of my oversensitivity rather than her cruelty. Amber, you know I didn't mean anything by what I said at the party. It was just family teasing, the way we've always talked to each other. You're being dramatic about this. I listened without responding, struck by her ability to reframe humiliation as humor, cruelty as family tradition. She'd called to make me complicit in forgetting what had happened, to convince me that my reaction was the problem rather than her actions. People are asking me why you haven't been by the house, she continued. It's embarrassing, having to make excuses for your behavior. Richard thinks you're being childish, and, honestly, so do I. We're family, Amber. Family forgives and moves on. The word family was particularly galling, given that she'd spent the anniversary party explaining why I didn't really belong to hers. But more than that, her tone suggested that I owed her forgiveness, that my continued absence was somehow punishing innocent people who'd simply witnessed her performance. I hung up without responding, not from anger but from clarity. There was nothing to discuss, no explanation that would change what had happened, no apology that would restore what had been broken. She'd made her choice in front of everyone who mattered to her social standing. Now I was making mine in the privacy of my own life. The silence that followed wasn't punishment. It was protection. I made the decision on a Tuesday morning, sitting in my office before the daily briefing. The choice wasn't emotional or reactive. It was tactical, the kind of strategic thinking the military had taught me to apply to complex problems. My mother had declared war on our relationship publicly, and I was responding with the appropriate level of engagement. None. No more financial support. The checks I'd sent monthly for 3 years stopped without explanation or warning. She'd have to adjust her budget, cancel her classes, maybe take out a loan for the kitchen renovations she'd been planning. But she'd also have to confront the practical value of the daughter she'd dismissed as worthless. No more holiday visits or family obligations. Christmas, Easter, birthdays, anniversaries, events that had become exercises in managing her criticism while pretending everything was normal. I wouldn't subject myself to environments where I was unwelcome, and I wouldn't pretend that her behavior was acceptable for the sake of social expectations. No more phone calls, no more updates about my life, no more attempts to maintain connection across the growing distance between us. She'd made it clear that I was an embarrassment to her new family narrative. I was giving her what she'd asked for, my absence from her story. The decision brought immediate relief, like setting down a heavy bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying. For 3 decades, I'd been trying to earn something she was incapable of giving. The effort had exhausted me in ways I hadn't fully understood until I stopped making it. But my mother wasn't prepared for the consequences of her choices. The first call came 2 weeks after I'd stopped sending money, her voice bright with forced casualness. Amber, honey, I think there might be a problem with the bank. My deposit didn't come through this month. I let it go to voicemail, then deleted it without listening to the end. She called twice more that day, her messages increasingly concerned and finally irritated. Amber, I need you to call me back immediately. This is important. Richard left messages too, his tone suggesting that my financial support was a given rather than a choice. Amber, your mother is worried about the bank situation. You need to call and sort this out. Family helps family. The entitlement was breathtaking. Apparently I owed them money because I'd been generous in the past. When phone calls didn't work, she tried email. Long messages explaining how my reaction was disproportionate, how family relationships required forgiveness, how I was disappointing people who cared about me. She was particularly focused on how my behavior was affecting Adam, as if my presence or absence in his life was somehow my responsibility rather than hers. Adam himself approached me at work, requesting another meeting to discuss personal matters. This time, his distress was more obvious and his questions more direct. Ma'am, my mother says you're not speaking to her because of something that happened at the party. She says she was just joking around, but that you took it the wrong way. She's really upset about it. I looked at this young man who'd been caught in the middle of a family drama he hadn't created, trying to be loyal to his stepmother while maintaining respect for his commanding officer. His position was impossible, and I felt genuine sympathy for him. Specialist, what do you remember about that evening? I asked. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting to criticize his stepmother, but unable to deny what he'd witnessed. She said some things that seemed harsh. About your service, about your character. I know she was drinking, and sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're celebrating. And you think she didn't mean it when she called me a failure and a bastard child in front of 30 people? The directness of the question made him wince. I don't know, ma'am. But she's my mother now, and she seems genuinely sorry about whatever happened. Maybe if you talked to her, you could work it out. I appreciated his loyalty to his family, even as I recognized his naivety about family dynamics. At 19, he still believed that apologies could fix betrayals, that good intentions could erase deliberate cruelty. The military would teach him otherwise eventually, but not through anything I said in my office. Your mother and I have different perspectives on what happened that evening, I told him. That's not your problem to solve, and it doesn't affect our professional relationship here. You report to me as your commanding officer, not as your stepmother's daughter. Keep those roles separate. The conversation troubled me, though, because it revealed how my mother was managing the fallout from her choices. She'd positioned herself as the victim of my overreaction, the caring mother trying to reconcile with an unreasonably angry daughter. She'd enlisted Adam as her messenger, using his genuine concern to pressure me into accepting her version of events. It was manipulative, but it was also familiar. She'd always been skilled at recruiting allies, at presenting herself as the reasonable party in conflicts she'd created. During my childhood, teachers, neighbors, relatives had all heard her version of our difficulties, how she was struggling to manage a difficult child who refused to appreciate everything she'd done. The pattern was repeating with adult stakes. She needed me to be the problem so she could remain the victim. My silence was threatening her narrative, forcing people to draw their own conclusions about our relationship. Without my participation in the drama, she couldn't control how the story was told. But I wasn't a child anymore, dependent on her approval for survival. I was a military officer with the training and experience to recognize manipulation when I saw it. Her attempts to pressure me into forgiveness only confirmed that I'd made the right choice in walking away. The silence continued, and slowly, her panic turned to anger. The messages became accusations. I was ungrateful, selfish, determined to punish innocent people for imaginary slights. She'd given me everything, sacrificed for my opportunities, and I was repaying her generosity with abandonment. I listened to none of them completely, but I caught enough to understand that she'd moved beyond denial into righteous indignation. In her version of events, she was the wronged party, and my withdrawal was evidence of my fundamental character flaws. It was exactly what I'd expected, and exactly what I'd needed to hear to know I was handling the situation correctly. The military teaches you that respect isn't personal, it's institutional. When Adam addressed me as ma'am during morning formation, he wasn't acknowledging Amber the individual, but Captain Paddington the commanding officer. The difference was crucial and, in my current family situation, liberating. My mother couldn't spin military protocol into a family dynamic she controlled. When Adam stood at attention, waiting for permission to speak, when he followed my orders without question, when he addressed me with the formal courtesy required by our respective ranks, he was participating in a system that recognized my authority regardless of his personal feelings or family loyalties. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the base. Here was a young man whose stepmother had publicly declared me a failure, now following my commands and seeking my approval for his professional development. The contrast was too obvious to ignore, too perfect to be anything but justice. During weapons training, I watched Adam focus completely on my instructions, absorbing techniques and corrections without the filter of family history. His respect in that moment was earned and professional, untainted by the complicated emotions that defined our connection outside the base. Staff Sergeant Reynolds commented on it after a particularly successful training exercise. "That Paddington kid is really coming along under your guidance, Captain. Reminds me of myself at that age, eager to prove himself, willing to learn from anyone who knows more." Anyone who knows more. The phrase carried weight in the context of my recent family drama. Here was recognition of my expertise from someone who'd observed my work for years, who'd seen my effectiveness in leadership positions, who understood competence when he saw it. My mother's opinion was irrelevant in this environment where performance was measured by objective standards. Adam began staying after formal training sessions to ask additional questions about tactics, leadership principles, career development. Initially, I wondered if his stepmother had coached him to seek extra contact, to create opportunities for family reconciliation. But his questions were thoughtful, his attention genuine, his interest in military excellence authentic. "Ma'am, how do you maintain authority without being authoritarian?" he asked after a leadership seminar I'd conducted for junior officers. "I've watched you handle difficult situations, and people respond to you differently than they do to other commanders. What's the difference?" It was a sophisticated question from someone barely 6 months into his military career. I realized he'd been observing not just my professional behavior, but my approach to leadership, analyzing what made some officers effective while others simply held rank. "Leadership is about serving the people you command," I told him. "Your authority exists to help them succeed, not to prove your own importance. When people understand that you're genuinely invested in their development, they'll follow you because they trust your judgment, not because they fear your rank." He absorbed this seriously, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated real thought about the principles behind military hierarchy. These conversations were purely professional, but they carried personal significance I couldn't ignore. Here was someone seeing me clearly, learning from my experience, respecting my judgment. The validation was quiet but profound. My mother began calling the base, requesting to speak with me about family emergencies that always proved to be manufactured urgencies designed to force contact. The duty officers learned to screen her calls, politely informing her that Captain Paddington was unavailable and would return her call if necessary. I never returned them. She tried showing up at the base entrance, but military security doesn't accommodate family drama. Visitors needed authorization for entry, and commanding officers weren't required to approve visits from relatives they preferred to avoid. She'd wait in the parking lot sometimes, watching personnel come and go, hoping to catch me during shift changes. Adam mentioned these visits awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with his stepmother's behavior, but unsure how to address it. "Ma'am, she's really concerned about you. She thinks something's wrong, that maybe you're having personal problems you can't talk about." The suggestion that my silence was evidence of problems rather than solutions would have been funny if it weren't so typical of her thinking. In her worldview, healthy people maintained family relationships regardless of how dysfunctional those relationships might be. My withdrawal was pathological rather than protective. "My personal life is stable and satisfying," I told Adam. "Sometimes the healthiest choice is to limit contact with people who consistently treat you poorly. Your stepmother and I have different perspectives on what constitutes appropriate family behavior." He nodded slowly, processing this information against whatever version of events he'd been hearing at home. I could see him working through the implications, beginning to understand that family relationships weren't automatically worth preserving if they caused more harm than good. The base became my sanctuary in ways I hadn't expected. Here, my competence was recognized, my leadership valued, my judgment trusted. People sought my advice, followed my direction, respected my expertise. The contrast with my family dynamic was stark and healing. Colonel Martinez, my immediate superior, called me into her office 6 months after the anniversary party incident. "Paddington, I've been watching your performance since that family situation became public knowledge. I want you to know that personal difficulties haven't affected your professional effectiveness. If anything, you seem more focused, more decisive." She was right. Without the constant drain of managing my mother's demands and expectations, I'd been able to invest more energy in my actual responsibilities. My performance evaluations showed improvement across multiple categories, and my leadership scores had reached new highs. The turning point came during Adam's 6-month review. As his commanding officer, I was required to provide a formal assessment of his progress, professional development, and potential for advancement. The evaluation would become part of his permanent military record and influence his future assignments and promotions. I could have been perfunctory, meeting the basic requirements without investing personal attention in his development. Given our family connection and his stepmother's behavior, no one would have questioned a purely professional approach that maintained appropriate distance. Instead, I found myself writing a comprehensive review that highlighted his genuine strengths and provided specific recommendations for his continued growth. Adam had earned respect through his own efforts, and I wasn't going to let family drama compromise his military career. When I called him in to discuss the evaluation, his surprise was obvious. "Ma'am, this is really positive." I wasn't sure what to expect, given everything that's happened. "Your family situation doesn't affect your professional performance," I told him. "This evaluation reflects your work, your attitude, your potential as a soldier. Nothing else matters in this context." He nodded gratefully, but I could see him processing the implications. Here was proof that competence transcended personal relationships, that respect could be earned rather than demanded, that authority worked best when it served a larger purpose than ego or control. My mother's attempts at contact became increasingly desperate and manipulative. She sent cards claiming family health emergencies that Adam later revealed were fabricated. She left voicemails about financial hardships that somehow required my immediate attention and assistance. She even tried using mutual friends as intermediaries, asking them to relay messages about her regret and desire for reconciliation. But each attempt only reinforced the wisdom of my decision to withdraw. She wasn't seeking to repair our relationship. She was trying to reestablish control over a narrative that had slipped beyond her management. Her focus remained on her own needs rather than any genuine understanding of how her behavior had affected me. The contrast between my work relationships and my family dynamics became a source of daily validation. Every morning, I walked onto a base where people knew my capabilities, trusted my judgment, and valued my contributions. Every interaction reinforced that I was competent, effective, and worthy of respect. My mother had spent decades convincing me that I was difficult, ungrateful, destined for failure despite her best efforts. But the evidence of my daily life contradicted every element of her assessment. I wasn't difficult, I was decisive. I wasn't ungrateful, I was independent. I wasn't failing, I was succeeding in an environment that measured success objectively. The liberation was gradual but profound. I began sleeping better, laughing more easily, investing energy in friendships and professional relationships that had been neglected while I focused on managing family crisis. Without the constant background noise of her disapproval, I could hear my own thoughts more clearly. Adam continued to develop under my command, his initial nervousness giving way to genuine confidence in his abilities. During a particularly challenging training exercise, he demonstrated the kind of leadership instincts that couldn't be taught, only encouraged and refined. "You handled that situation well," I told him afterward. You read the terrain correctly, adapted your tactics when the original plan wasn't working, and kept your team focused under pressure. That's the kind of thinking that separates good soldiers from great ones. He beamed at the praise, and I realized this might be the first time anyone in his family had acknowledged his military potential with genuine pride rather than obligatory support. His stepmother praised his service in general terms, but I was recognizing specific competencies that would shape his career trajectory. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" he said as we walked back to the base. "How do you know when you're making the right decisions?" "I mean, when there's no clear protocol, when you have to trust your own judgment." It was a question that went beyond military tactics to fundamental questions of confidence and self-trust. "You develop judgment through experience," I told him. "You make decisions, observe the consequences, learn from both successes and mistakes. Eventually, you trust your instincts because they're based on knowledge you've earned through practice." He considered this seriously. "My stepmother says you're making a mistake by not talking to her. But watching you work, seeing how people respond to your leadership. I don't think you make decisions lightly or without good reasons." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging that his stepmother might be wrong about something significant. I appreciated his loyalty to her, but I also recognized that he was beginning to form his own judgments based on his own observations. "People can disagree about personal relationships and still respect each other professionally," I said. "Your stepmother and I have different perspectives on family obligations. That doesn't make either of us wrong in general, just incompatible in specific ways." The conversation marked a shift in our dynamic. Adam was beginning to separate his stepmother's opinions from his own observations, developing the kind of independent thinking that would serve him well throughout his military career. He was learning that respect could be earned through competence rather than demanded through family relationships. My mother's narrative was losing power, undermined by daily evidence that contradicted her basic assumptions about my character and capabilities. She'd called me a failure in front of everyone who mattered to her social standing. But failure doesn't command respect from subordinates, doesn't earn positive performance evaluations, doesn't get promoted through competitive military hierarchies. The quiet satisfaction of professional success was deeper and more lasting than any family validation I'd once craved. Here was proof that I'd built a life worth living despite her lack of support, that I'd developed capabilities she'd never recognized, that I'd earned a place in the world through my own efforts. The table hadn't just turned, it had been completely rebuilt, with respect flowing in the direction it belonged. She started small, the way people do when they're testing whether their previous behavior has consequences. A birthday card arrived 3 weeks late, with a generic message about hoping I was well and a brief note that she'd been thinking about me. No acknowledgement of what had happened at the anniversary party, no reference to the months of silence that had followed. I filed it with other mail I didn't need to keep and didn't need to answer. 2 weeks later, she called during what she knew were my duty hours, leaving a voicemail that sounded carefully rehearsed. "Amber, honey, I know we've had some misunderstandings lately, but I was hoping we could talk. I miss you, and I think there are things we should discuss as adults." Misunderstandings. As if her public humiliation of me had been a communication error rather than a deliberate choice to elevate herself at my expense. The word choice was typical of her approach to conflict resolution, minimizing her actions while suggesting that I'd somehow misinterpreted her intentions. A month passed before the next attempt. This time, she sent a longer letter, handwritten on her good stationery, explaining how much she regretted that unfortunate evening and how she hoped we could move past our differences for the sake of family unity. She mentioned Adam specifically, noting how torn he felt between his loyalty to her and his respect for me. The manipulation was skillful but transparent. She was using Adam's genuine distress about our family situation to pressure me into accepting her version of reconciliation. In her framework, my continued silence was hurting an innocent young man who'd done nothing wrong. Therefore, maintaining boundaries was selfish and cruel. I felt sympathy for Adam, but not enough to sacrifice my own well-being for his comfort. He was learning valuable lessons about family dynamics, personal boundaries, and the difference between loyalty and enabling. These were lessons that would serve him throughout his life, even if they were uncomfortable to learn. The letters became more frequent and more elaborate. She wrote about memories from my childhood, emphasizing the sacrifices she'd made as a single mother, the pride she'd felt when I graduated high school, the worry she'd experienced during my deployments. She was constructing a narrative of maternal love that conveniently omitted decades of criticism and conditional approval. Each letter followed the same pattern: brief acknowledgement that mistakes were made, passive voice, no specific ownership, followed by lengthy descriptions of her positive feelings toward me, concluding with requests for a phone call or visit to work things out. She was offering reconciliation without accountability, relationship without change. The most telling aspect of her campaign was what she didn't address. Never once did she acknowledge the specific words she'd used at the anniversary party. Never did she recognize the deliberate nature of her public humiliation. Never did she demonstrate understanding of why those actions had been relationship-ending rather than merely hurtful. Instead, she focused on the consequences for her. How my absence was affecting her social relationships, how people were asking uncomfortable questions about our family situation, how she was having to make excuses for my behavior. Even her apologies centered on her own needs rather than any genuine understanding of the harm she'd caused. Adam mentioned her efforts during one of our professional conversations. "Ma'am, she really does seem sorry about what happened. She talks about you a lot, about wanting to fix things between you. What specifically does she say she wants to fix?" I asked. He paused, clearly thinking through recent conversations. "She says she wants you to understand that she didn't mean to hurt your feelings, that family should be able to joke with each other without taking things too seriously." There it was, the core of her misunderstanding. She still framed her deliberate cruelty as joking, my legitimate response as oversensitivity. She wanted me to accept that her behavior was normal family teasing rather than public humiliation, designed to elevate her new family at my expense. Adam, when someone repeatedly tells you that your hurt feelings are evidence of your own character flaws rather than their problematic behavior, that's not an apology. That's an attempt to avoid accountability while making you responsible for the relationship's problems. He absorbed this quietly, and I could see him comparing my words to his stepmother's explanations. The military was teaching him to value clear communication and personal responsibility. Her approach to conflict resolution didn't align with those principles. 6 months after her campaign began, she tried a different strategy. Instead of letters or phone calls, she showed up at a base ceremony where families were invited to attend. She'd driven 3 hours, dressed carefully, positioned herself where I couldn't miss seeing her during the event. It was a calculated move designed to force interaction in a public setting where my options were limited. I could acknowledge her presence and risk being drawn into a conversation I didn't want, or I could ignore her and appear rude to colleagues who knew she was my mother. I chose a third option. After the ceremony, I approached her directly, spoke quietly, and kept the interaction brief. "I appreciate you coming to support the troops today. I hope you enjoyed the ceremony." Then I moved on to other conversations with people I was genuinely pleased to see. She followed me, trying to extend the interaction, but I maintained professional focus on the event's purpose rather than our personal relationship. By the time she realized I wasn't going to engage in family discussion, I was surrounded by colleagues discussing the ceremony and upcoming training exercises. She left without the confrontation or reconciliation she'd been seeking, but not without making her presence known to everyone who mattered in my professional life. People had seen her, noted the family resemblance, observed our brief but polite interaction. They'd drawn their own conclusions about our relationship dynamic. Staff Sergeant Reynolds commented later that evening, "Your mother seems like an interesting woman, Captain. Very determined." It was a diplomatic way of saying she'd appeared desperate rather than dignified, strategic rather than spontaneous. Military personnel are trained to recognize manipulation, and her behavior at the ceremony had been obviously calculated rather than genuinely supportive. The incident marked the end of her direct attempts at reconciliation. She'd exhausted the reasonable approaches, letters, phone calls, public gestures, without achieving the response she wanted. My boundaries had held, my silence had continued, and her narrative about our relationship was losing credibility with each failed attempt at contact. but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of peace. I demonstrated to myself and others that I could maintain professional composure while protecting personal boundaries. I could be civil without being available, polite without being vulnerable. Her desperation had revealed the truth about our relationship more clearly than any explanation I could have offered. People had witnessed her behavior and my response, and they'd formed their own judgments about which approach seemed healthier. The letters stopped coming. The phone calls ended. The social media attempts at public reconciliation disappeared. She'd finally accepted what I'd known for months. Some relationships can't be repaired because they were never healthy to begin with. My mother's silence, when it finally came, felt different from my own. Mine had been protective, strategic, designed to create space for healing and growth. Hers felt defeated, resentful, tinged with the anger of someone who'd expected a different outcome from her efforts. But defeat or not, it gave me something I'd never had before: peace. I came to understand that the anniversary party had been a gift, though not the kind my mother intended. Her public cruelty had forced a clarity I'd been avoiding for years, a recognition that our relationship was fundamentally toxic rather than merely difficult. For 3 decades, I'd been trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it, seeking approval from someone who needed me to fail in order to feel successful herself. The pattern had been so established, so much a part of my identity, that I'd never questioned whether it was worth maintaining. Her decision to humiliate me publicly had broken the pattern by making it impossible to ignore. When someone calls you a failure in front of 30 people, there's no ambiguity about their feelings, no room for interpretation or hope for change. The relationship's true nature becomes undeniable. But the real gift wasn't the clarity about her character, it was the discovery of my own strength. I'd survived her rejection, maintained my dignity, protected my well-being, and continued to thrive professionally. The approval I'd been seeking from her was unnecessary because I'd already earned respect from people whose opinions actually mattered. My colleagues saw my competence daily. My subordinates responded to my leadership because it was effective, not because I demanded their respect. My superiors trusted my judgment because I demonstrated good decision-making over time. These relationships were based on observable performance rather than family obligation. Adam had become a particular source of satisfaction, not because of our family connection, but because of his development as a soldier. Under my guidance, he'd grown from an uncertain recruit into a confident junior officer with genuine leadership potential. His respect for me was earned through professional excellence rather than inherited through family relationships. During his year-end evaluation, I recommended him for advanced training that would accelerate his career trajectory. The recommendation was based purely on merit, his scores, his performance, his demonstrated abilities. But I took quiet pride in knowing that his stepmother's real child was succeeding under the guidance of the daughter she'd dismissed as worthless. "Ma'am, I want to thank you for believing in me," he said after receiving notification of his acceptance into the advanced program. "I know our family situation has been complicated, but you've never let that affect your professional judgment. It means more than you know." He was right that our family situation had been complicated, but wrong about its impact on my professional judgment. If anything, the complications had made me more determined to treat him fairly, to ensure that his opportunities weren't limited by his stepmother's behavior or my response to it. "You earn this opportunity through your own efforts," I told him. "Your performance, your attitude, your potential, those are the only factors that matter in military evaluation. Personal relationships don't influence professional assessments." But privately, I appreciated the irony. My mother had spent years telling anyone who would listen that I was a failure, a disappointment, someone who couldn't be counted on for real responsibility. Yet here was her new son succeeding under my direct leadership, his career advancing because of my professional judgment and recommendation. The justice was perfect because it was natural rather than vengeful. I hadn't needed to plot revenge or engineer consequences for her behavior. Her own actions had created a situation where her judgment was obviously flawed, her narrative clearly false, her assessment of my character demonstrably wrong. People who'd known me professionally had seen the contrast between her public claims and my actual performance. They'd watched me maintain dignity under attack, continue to excel despite family drama, treat even her son with fairness and respect. The evidence of my character spoke louder than her accusations ever could. My career continued to advance based on merit rather than family background. Promotions came through competitive evaluation, leadership opportunities emerged through demonstrated competence, peer respect accumulated through consistent performance. I'd built a professional reputation that existed independently of family opinion or approval. The financial independence that military service provided had always been important, but it became symbolically crucial after cutting off support to my mother. I was entirely self-sufficient, owing nothing to anyone, dependent on my own efforts for survival and success. The money I'd once sent home stayed in my accounts, growing into real security rather than disappearing into someone else's comfort. For the first time in my adult life, I was living entirely for myself, making decisions based on my own values, pursuing goals that mattered to me, investing time and energy in relationships that were mutual rather than one-sided. The freedom was intoxicating and slightly overwhelming. Without the constant background stress of managing my mother's expectations, I discovered interests and capabilities I'd been too distracted to develop. I took classes in subjects that fascinated me rather than ones that might impress her. I formed friendships with people who appreciated my company rather than tolerated it. I made plans based on my own desires rather than family obligations. The transformation was gradual but profound. Colleagues began commenting on changes in my demeanor, more relaxed during meetings, quicker to laugh at appropriate humor, more willing to take creative risks in problem-solving. I was becoming the person I might have been all along if I hadn't spent so much energy seeking approval from someone determined to withhold it. My mother's story about family and success had been revealed as fiction, but in its place, I discovered a true story about competence, respect, and self-determination. She'd wanted to erase me from her narrative, but instead, she'd freed me to write my own. The quiet justice of the situation was that her perfect family depended on the guidance and leadership of the daughter she'd publicly rejected. Every promotion Adam earned, every advancement in his military career, every demonstration of his growing competence reflected my influence and investment in his development. She couldn't claim credit for his success without acknowledging my role in creating it. She couldn't diminish my value without undermining her son's achievements. She'd trapped herself in a contradiction of her own making, where her preferred narrative about family and worth simply didn't align with observable reality. The evening when Adam made sergeant ahead of his scheduled timeline, he called to share the news. His excitement was genuine and infectious, and I felt the satisfaction that comes from watching someone you've mentored achieve recognition they've earned. "Ma'am, I know this promotion came because of the foundation you helped me build. The leadership training, the tactical knowledge, the confidence to make hard decisions. I learned all of that under your command." It was generous of him to acknowledge my contribution, but it was also accurate. His success was his own, but it had been shaped by my professional guidance and investment in his development. The chain of cause and effect was clear to anyone who understood military advancement. My mother had called me a failure in front of everyone who mattered to her social standing. But failures don't develop successful leaders. Failures don't earn the respect of subordinates who have other options. Failures don't build careers through competence and judgment. Her new son's success was living proof that her assessment of my worth had been wrong from the beginning. Every time he advanced, every time he demonstrated the skills I'd helped him develop, every time he showed the kind of character that comes from good mentorship, her narrative about my inadequacy became more obviously false. The title she'd mocked, commander, captain, the rank that meant nothing in her living room, was the one that had shaped her son's future and earned his genuine respect. The daughter she'd dismissed had become the leader her family depended on for guidance they couldn't acknowledge publicly. It was justice without cruelty, consequence without revenge, truth revealing itself through simple persistence and professional excellence. I hadn't needed to prove her wrong. She'd proven herself wrong by choosing to judge competence she'd never bothered to understand. Years later, when Adam was deployed overseas and I'd been promoted to major, the final piece of irony revealed itself. He wrote to me regularly, professional updates mixed with personal gratitude that had evolved into genuine friendship. His letters mentioned his stepmother occasionally, always with the careful distance of someone who'd learned to see family relationships clearly. She still talks about you sometimes, he wrote from his assignment in Germany. Usually when she's trying to explain to people why her son is doing so well in the military. She's started saying that good leadership must run in the family, that you learned everything from her example of strength and determination. It's remarkable how memory can reshape itself when reality becomes inconvenient. I laughed reading that paragraph, recognizing the predictable evolution of her narrative. She couldn't erase my influence on Adam's career, so she'd begun claiming credit for my competence. The daughter she'd called a failure had become evidence of her successful parenting, retroactively transformed into proof of her wisdom and guidance. The reinvention was complete when she began attending military family events as Adam's mother, introducing herself to other parents with stories about her daughter the Major, her pride in our family's tradition of service, her sacrifice in raising children who chose demanding careers. She'd become the military mother she'd spent years mocking, wearing the identity like a borrowed coat that almost fit. Friends who still moved in her social circles reported these performances with amused bewilderment. The same woman who'd publicly declared me a bastard failure was now bragging about her successful military children, accepting congratulations for raising such accomplished adults, positioning herself as an expert on military family dynamics. Adam found it both disturbing and fascinating. She's convinced herself that she always supported your career, that the problems between you were misunderstandings rather than deliberate cruelty. It's like watching someone rewrite history in real time. But her revisionist storytelling couldn't change the fundamental facts. I'd built my career without her support, earned respect despite her criticism, succeeded specifically because I'd learned to value my own judgment over her opinions. Her current pride in my achievements was meaningless because it was based on outcomes she'd tried to prevent rather than efforts she'd encouraged. The real measure of our relationship's transformation was that her approval no longer mattered to me. She could claim credit, deny history, or ignore my existence entirely. None of it affected the life I'd built or the satisfaction I drew from professional accomplishment and genuine relationships. Sometimes I wondered if she remembered that anniversary party clearly, if she could still hear her own voice calling me a failure in front of 30 people. But wondering was just curiosity, not longing. The woman who'd needed to humiliate me to feel worthy was a stranger whose opinion carried no weight in my actual life. The military had taught me that respect flows toward confidence, that authority serves purpose larger than ego, that true strength comes from lifting others rather than diminishing them. These lessons had shaped me into someone my mother never understood and never would. Her loss was profound, but it was entirely her own creation. Adam's success continued to reflect the kind of leadership that emerges from genuine mentorship rather than borrowed glory. He'd earned every advancement through confidence I'd helped him develop, character he'd chosen to embrace, and judgment he'd learned to trust. His stepmother could claim credit all she wanted, but the evidence of good influence was written in his decisions, his integrity, his respect for others. The justice was complete not because she'd been punished, but because truth had prevailed despite her attempts to control the narrative. My worth wasn't determined by her assessment, never had been, never would be. The title she'd mocked had become the foundation of respect that no revision of history could diminish or erase. That was my story of finally drawing the line with my own mother. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone who is supposed to support you? How did you handle it when family loyalty clashed with self-respect? Drop your experience in the comments. I read every one. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more true stories, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they're not alone in setting boundaries.